Hello, and thank you very much. I shall share my screen. And yes, thank you. Brian Posthlewaite here to talk to you about FHIR questionnaires and structured data capture. And assuming everything's all going technically correctly, I'm a solutions architect from Telstra Health down here in Australia, and I'm a co-chair of patient administration at HL7 International, and also on the FHIR management group. I'm a contributor to some open source projects that, if you're on the .NET stack, you've probably used in the FHIR.NET API, and also the web API in the same line. And an implementer of SDC, and have had that in production for a number of years now. Admittedly, that's been on DSTU2, but we've got a R4 build out now. And yeah, working with FHIR since 2014, so back in the early days. So really what I'm going to cover today is really, FHIR questionnaires and structured data capture, which is really like your survey monkey for FHIR, for healthcare. So the question I'd like to ask is, well, why did we standardise this? Aren't there heaps of products out there like SurveyMonkey and other forms engines that we can just use? And the answer I often come up with is, yeah, those things, they do work really well, but they only capture and handle the actual collection portion. So they don't do anything to facilitate how do we collect stuff and pre-populate before that point. How do they interact with things that are not healthcare, so in terminologies? And then once I've got that data, what can I do with it after that point? So it's sort of, that's why we looked at it. And when you're in one particular app, you're locked to that app. So trying to get across systems becomes really hard. And looking between health systems, then the chances of them using the same forms engine is pretty low. So we standardized it. So we're going to cover today, what are some common uses, where do we see them, which FHIR resources sort of covers this structured data capture area, what are the common workflows you see across, how do we do validation, how do we handle errors, what are some tools out there to create questionnaires, how do we do that, and rendering, and then finally some pre-population. So before I jump into anything, sort of structured data capture is an extra implementation guide on top of the core FHIR specification. And it really goes from that baseline simple resources that we've got, and then adds an extra set of capabilities and advanced features on top of that definition, specifically around rendering and advanced behaviors, importing data into the forms from new clinical systems, so how do we interact? And then once I've completed the data, how can I take that completed content and move it out into other content? It's very close to a final publication on R4. We've been saying that for a while, but we've essentially closed out all of the open JIRA tickets or tracker items, whatever we want to call them now. And so we're just going through that final fit and finish to get that out and published. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm not really going to try and say, this is core spec, this is SDC implementation guide, because it's really all the one thing. So it's just, there's been a logical break in between the two things so that we could get the core publication out and have the more advanced content, which is going to need to iterate separately as something that can be iterated separately. Cool. So moving on, so I've just got up here a heap of different use cases where we see FHIR questionnaires being used. We see a lot of different contexts, assessments in primary care and consumers, surveys, government statutory firms, referral templates, admission forms, care plans, and the list just goes on. Even general data entry, we can use FHIR questionnaires for that capacity. You can see here from these types of data entry, the definitions have come from different places. Some of them are being defined by a receiver that wants to get a specific format. Some of them are being entered by a consumer, and others are being collected by clinical and non-clinical staff. So there's a real variety. And so me personally, I've been involved with quite a few of them. And the one that's a big pain point to me, and I'm sick of turning up at a hospital or a clinic or whatever, and being handed the clipboard and say, okay, fill in out your details. I've done this how many times, and allowing that stuff to pre-populate from data I already have, just an amazing thing to move on with. So what are the FHIR resources that really cover this structured data capture area? I guess the first one that comes to mind, the questionnaire. It's really the definitional resource. It's the thing that describes what is the data that we're going to capture. It's very similar to a structure definition, but the similarities are in its usage and what it does. But it defines, so where a structure definition defines the resources from a core spec perspective, and then we go and create profiles, which are structure definitions, on top of a patient to say, okay, so this is the Australian version of a patient. With questionnaires, we don't create a profile to say, I want to create a profile to do a referral form. We don't do that. We actually just create a questionnaire resource with the data that we want to collect. So that's sort of where they're similar and yet different. So, so if you want to create a new questionnaire to collect some data, don't create a structure definition, create a questionnaire. It might include the value sets and terminologies, so value set and code system, so we need those resources. And then we need the questionnaire response resource, which links through into the questionnaire, which is through a canonical, so which may or may not be direct. And then we want the links out to the other, so the subject that's going to be referred to by the collected data, which is usually the patient, but could be other things. So it could be an encounter, it could be an episode of care, it could be an observation, it could be a practitioner, because you might be doing a general feedback form or a leave request form. So forms don't have to be clinical in nature, and they have their own context. So from a resource definition itself, so we have the questionnaire itself has metadata. So in that metadata, we've got the canonical URL, which is how this specific, so if it was a referral template, how this specific template is recognized across systems. So the canonical URL won't change. And it also has the version number that goes along with that. So if it gets distributed, we can still understand what that was when we go and reference from data back to it. And it also has where is this appropriate to be used. Is this meant to be connecting to a patient? So it doesn't connect a reference to the patient. That's what happens with the questionnaire response, but it says that I'm meant to be connected to a patient. And then we have the actual questions, so the items. So a questionnaire has an item collection and an item has an item collection. So we can create an arbitrarily sized tree of items, which are the questions and groups within that. So most important is our link ID, which is how everything all joins together. So along with that is the text. So think about the name, or the name of the field, a little bit of display label, the item type, what type of data entry is this? Is it a string field? Is it a text field? Is it a date field? Is it a choice set? And then is it repeats, data rules, so for validation, for min-max, that type of thing, and then some formatting hints. So if it's a choice, do I want to use a drop-down? Do I want to use a radio set? That type of thing. And then from a questionnaire response perspective, what's the context again? So who's the patient that this set of data has been entered for? Who's the author? So who collected this data? And then the set of actual answers themselves. And yes, they also have a link ID, and that must match. So the link ID in the questionnaire response must match the link ID in the questionnaire. And then, of course, the most important thing, the actual value, which is the whole point. And just, I don't think I'll mention this enough, and I'll probably mention it at least 2 more times. The link ID must match between the questionnaire response and the questionnaire, including the nesting depth. So if we've got a tree on the left in our questionnaire, we should expect to find a tree on the right with the questionnaire response. And so we've now flicked over to the actual set of all of the available item types. And don't let me scare you, I'm not going to walk through the entire slide. I'll just pick out a handful of them, just so that you can get an understanding that there is a whole lot of stuff here, and sort of how you can navigate that when you come to go and walk through this yourselves as you go through it. So probably the most important ones are group. So if you're going to collect some items, you need to use a group. So it'll have expected to have children. They might be repeating, or it could just be for a section, for a layout. It could be for a table, or maybe tabs if you're doing a tab control. Then we have a display item, which means that this is just going to be a display that you're going to sit on the screen to provide information to the person who's entering the data, and we're not going to collect an answer for that. So there's no control. We've got string and text. Well, aren't they the same thing? Yes, they are from the terms of what data you get back, but really that's a UI hint as well. The string being a short single line text box, text being potentially multi-paragraph style line. And I'll look down with choice and open choice. You've got some extensions which allow you to say with a choice, is this going to be a radio button, a checkbox, a combo box, or an autocomplete? Now, I'll talk a bit more about those later when we go through the demos. And open choice is very similar to choice, except it allows you to have either a value coding or a value string. So a choice means it's always going to be a coding selected from a terminology, where an open choice, you could provide free string, free text, in case of it not finding a value in the terminology. Cool, and since we've just brought up terminology, let's dive in a bit further, because terminologies and using the structured data capture, being able to use the terminology of the target system where you're sending it is one of the strengths, to make sure that we've got accurately and properly structured and coded content. That's a really strong capacity. So the 2 option types within the questionnaire definition are the choice and open choice. The actual definition of which terminology to use, there's a value set reference in the item called answer value set, and so that's a canonical reference to the specific form. But that could also be not just an external value set and terminology, it could be a contained terminology as well. So there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. You might want to customize a filter in terms of what coded values are applicable. So you could contain a value set so that when we do the filtering, or when the user types in and the renderer does the filtering, it can pass that value set across to limit down the results that come back. Another popular one is if you don't have a formal terminology and you just want to have a handful of values, you could contain a value set expansion with those values fixed into it, and then you can share that across a lot of different values in the questionnaire. So that's really good if you've got a form that's got 20 or 30 fields which are yes, no, maybe style thing, or you've got a couple of different options like that. Yes, no, maybe there is a terminology for, but then you can reuse. So it increases your reuse across the same questionnaire. The other option is using an answer options value coding, where you can say you don't have a predefined terminology, you don't want to share it across multiple questions because there's only 3 answers and I only need to have them in this one place. So you can just use a value coding with answer options, nice and simple, and it's all in that one place, so you don't have to go hunting around. It's nice and condensed. There's an initial selected on that, so if you think you've got a combo box that's being used for the rendering, initial selected would say this particular value is what will be there by default. So when you open the form and go new, it'll have this is the value to select and use. We have repeat. So why would I be interested in repeat on a terminology? Well, that'll impact what the user experience is. It means I can have multiple values from this coding to go into the question. So ones that you might find about is which of these conditions did you experience in the last 3 weeks? And so there's 5 options and you go tick, 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 and that's quite good. So that's why we'd have repeat. And depending on that control selection, so if I had multi-select, radio buttons are not going to work, so I need to use checkboxes. If you've got only 3 or 4 items, maybe 10, radio buttons might be okay. But if you're going past that, you're probably walking into a combo box situation. And if you're wandering out into hundreds or thousands of codes, then none of those options really make sense. You're walking into an autocomplete style situation. So as a designer of the form, just consider the potential number of entries in that terminology and how that would impact the user's experience with that. And so our extensions that fit into that space, our item control is really what drives radio buttons, combo boxes, that. Our option exclusive, if I've got a repeating set to say I've got A, B, C, and D means none of the above, I could put option exclusive on my option D, and then I'll know that that one must, if they're going to tick that, I'll go and unselect the others from a user experience. I could do that. From a validation perspective, if they've selected multiple of that and my user interface didn't check that, then I can reject that as a failure and pass that through. Our preferred terminology server. So with terminologies, we need a server, so where they are more than just a simple answer set or a contained set, I need a server to go and evaluate the filter or contain a large, say you've got an 80,000 item terminology. I'm not going to include that in the questionnaire. I want that external. That needs to be evaluated. So we've got an extension that says preferred terminology server, which we can point to a specific terminology server if we want. That can be at the root, the top level of the questionnaire to apply to the whole questionnaire, or it could be on a single item itself and say this one requires a specific set of terminologies which are on our geolocation terminology service, and so point that over there. If I don't have that set, the default behavior is assume that the place where you got the questionnaire from can resolve and perform the terminology services. Then we've got a handful of others around units and the actual operation that we interact with the terminology through is always going to be the expand operation and deals with the expansion itself. So that's good. So our initial value, so when we go and create our form and say I want to create a new form, or start entering data into a form, our initial value gives us the capacity from a definition to define some initial values to be used. So these could be defaults that fit within. So if it's a Victorian referral form, which is a local state here, then default the local entry. There's other types of values. So did you have a condition, say no, and make them drive to go and create it. And so with repeating groups, so if we've got an initial value on groups, so each time you add a new row to a table or a new section, so if it's a repeating set group section, then an initial value will be honoured at that point where you create that new row. So that's something that sort of has to be done on the client side in the renderer. It's not something that a server side is typically going to do, which sort of brings me down to might be done on the client or the server. And that's really around, was there a populate going on? So did I do a pre-population, at which point it will have looked at other content using the STC's initial expression in Firepath to go and retrieve that content and then pre-fill onto the screen. So there's a little bit of timing that goes on between where do I get the data from the populate and where do I get the content from initial values. So we expect that initial value would go in and then we do a populate which would override that content, and then the user would participate with it from that point. I'll talk about the initial expression a little bit later when we actually walk through pre-populate and cover the demonstrations through there. So dynamic behaviour. So that brings us to, we've sort of covered a little bit about the basic structure of a questionnaire, the properties that we find in the questionnaire, how they interact with terminologies. So now we want to actually get a little bit more fancy, and so not just a set of static fields on a screen. We now want to make those fields actually interact with each other. We want to say if this field on question 1 is answered with an A, then we want to show question B. Or if I've ticked question B's other option, then I want to show another text box with the other, so I can then go and type in the other reason. So that's a real good example. So this question value is entered with the link ID of the question that you want to refer to. And then our operator, we have exists, equals, not equals, and then the numeric style comparisons. And also if I've got a value set which happens to understand orders, then those will work as well. So equal and not equal are pretty clear. So question 1 equals string A or coding A, whichever is appropriate. So you want that to match the data type of your question, except for exists. So exists means has question 1 been answered? So is an answer present? And so where's not exists? Well, not exists means the answer value. So enable when question 1 operator exists boolean true is that answer is there. If I want to say this answer isn't there, then I'll say question 1 exists, no, false. And so that's that capability. So that's pretty simple, one-to-one capacity. Now, if I've got 2 questions, so if question 1 and question 2 are both answered with a specific value, then I want question 3 to show, then that's where I need to have 2 enable when rules, one for question 1 and one for question 2 with its condition, and then I need to specify the enable behavior to say whether it's all or any. So all means both rules, if there's 2 rules, so both of them have to evaluate to true for it to be enabled, or the any is your or case. So if question 1 or question 2, then we'll enable. So if I want to do something more complicated than that, to say I want to do this and this or some other form of calculation than what these simple ones imply, I can use an enable when expression, which gives me the full flexibility of the Firepath evaluation engine, and leverage that, and then not use any of these actual enable when options. I just use the enable when condition, so expression, and job done. So that's cool. And just to note that these behaviors can and should affect validation and required. If I've got a conditional field that's hidden because of an enable when rule, then its required checking doesn't need to be verified. So other conditions don't need to be checked. So that means we're doing really well for timing. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'll have a quick look at some sample questionnaires that I've prepared earlier. I'm hoping it gets the right screen. Okay, so this is the right screen. So this is the structured data capture guide. If people want to get to, there was a link at the start, but now you've seen it just in case you want to go there for a look. So I've got some canned examples. So this particular one is a little bit of everything. So we can see in there, we've got our metadata at the top. We've got the name, it's a bit of everything. Title, a bit of everything is what we will show people. It's an active one, when it was published. And then I've got my set of questions, which are all items. So items, our first one is a group, which has got a lot of our questions in it. I've got a string, I've got a text. Remember our text was our multi-line. So we don't have a current extension for how big that should be. So the company I work for, we've created our own internal extension to say 10 lines of row. We've got booleans, dates, date times, just a little bit of anything. So if you're doing a test and you wanted to see a choice control being used, and here's a value set referenced, then we've got a drop down. So to say here's an item control being used for a drop down, and another one for each. So that's the choice. And the next one, we've got an autocomplete. So it's a nice bit of everything. So we'll run our test. And so that'll open up that same form and load it. And here we go. So we can see a user interface. So string, more text, so get that idea. All of these sorts of user experiences for type in non-decimals. So there's a set of radio buttons for a terminology, a drop list for a set of terminology, countries, Netherlands. If I try and put something else in, no good there. This is an open choice, so I can select the coding, or I can type some rubbish in. And if I try and save that, I actually go and say, well, this one was fine because it's open choice, whereas this one says, no, it's not there. You have to choose from the autocomplete, autocomplete being no. So that's kind of cool. Another one, just to see some more simple tests. It's just a handful of controls. And see here, I've got some of them have been marked as mandatory, just to get a bit of a tip on that. And we've got another one here, so I'll have a look at that. And this one, you can see that's a significantly larger questionnaire. It's got many more fields. It's got some tabs. It's got AU, so I'm going to enter some stuff from Austria. You get the idea. So we've got more tabs, more content. So you can get the idea that that's coming through. And so some enable when capacities. So test. So if I go on entering a value, you can see there I've got some additional fields. So if I say nothing, if I say no, there's an answer. So yes, no, there's that. So some more enable when tests. So this is where I've gone to town with all of those sort of comparisons where you can say enable when ticked. If I've got a decimal field and I say 4, I say 4.5, 5, 5.6. So you can see that you can get all those sorts of combinations. Let's say where this is test. Sorry, test. So you can get some more fields. Test T, test into. So you can get that sort of capacity. Multi-select, so nothing with that one. You get a field with that one, nothing with that one. But if I've got that one and that one, so I can get extra content. So there's a multi-select choice, and then another one which is the simple choice. So it's B, and show something. Let's see if I didn't close something on there. So that's our set of sample questionnaires there. So looking good. So now a little bit about the actual workflow that we would normally go through when we're dealing with questionnaires in general. So it seems like a simple statement is we need to get the questionnaire from somewhere. We need to locate it for a given context. We need to then render it, load it, get any referenced content, do all that pre-form generation stuff. So pre-populate it and make sure it's there so that the user can interact with it. Next step, enter that user data. So local validations might be going on whilst they're interacting with it, accessing the terminology, pulling the information in, entering new content, and then prepared for the save. So then we can do that questionnaire response, which is the data we've entered. We can get that validated by the server. And so I've sort of made that as a separate stage to actually committing the content, so which is the final stage. So during that validation, we can get back any errors and warnings and issues that we can report back to the user before they go and actually commit. So particularly with warnings, so you might have some data that they've entered that you might have some concerns to say, hey, you've entered this, are you sure? So you recorded that you've entered admission for a maternity case and the gender has been marked as male. Maybe we want to check that. And there's all sorts of reasons why this could be the case. So we don't want to say that is a hard and fast error, reject it. Of course, there are reasons why you would do that. But warnings, we might say, do you want to do this? And they go, yep, that's fine. We know what we're doing. Save it anyway. But we can report that back to the user. And then, of course, it's actually saved to the server. And something that a server might do from that point is it might extract that content into other resources. It might kick off other workflows within the system. Say if it was a pre-admission form and you said, yes, I need an interpreter, they might start going and requesting that an interpreter be available for that encounter. So that type of activity. Fetching questionnaires, as I mentioned, questionnaires are a standard FHIR resource, so we can do standard searching capacities. The other capability is we might be getting a reference through a directory, and so that directory might say, I want to go and make a referral to this particular clinic, and that particular clinic might have a specific template that you need to use, and that template is defined by a FHIR questionnaire. That association is not currently defined by FHIR at the moment, but it's something that we are working through to get that to happen. So then, of course, there's the rendering, recording responses, going through, interpreting that. The definition of the questionnaire is really a hint. It may be rendered differently based on different data entry devices. If you've got a mobile phone or a disability-focused application or a chat-style conversational system, they might render that content differently, or it might be just down a mobile phone where your form factor is really limited. So it's really allowing that level of flexibility. And just to bring it back and say, wave my flag, link ID, make sure it's the same questionnaire response. I think I've done that enough. With the posting the questionnaires, it's just a regular post like you save any other FHIR resource, and validating the content. One thing I might flag is questionnaire responses can be in a draft state. So if you've got some validation rules that are not passing, you might still allow that to save as long as it's in a draft state. So that's just a little flag and a little tick on there. And there might be additional processing. And then once that is stored in the system, it's just a standard FHIR resource questionnaire response. So you can go and return that by ID. You can go and search that based on the questionnaire that was filled in. So I know this is the assessment form for A, so I can search by that. Or I can go chaining through the questionnaire response.subject to find the patient or the status. Is this a draft or a completed from that perspective? But most importantly, that individual response data, so if you had a questionnaire response that said, are you a smoker? You can't actually search questionnaire responses for that field. The FHIR standard response structures don't try and index that content. So that's where you should go and do some additional processing to extract that content into observations or somewhere else to see that. So that's where extract operation comes in. I'm not going to talk about that, but Ilya Beta later on in the week, I believe, has a session that may be walking into that. So into validation and errors. So there's multiple stages that go on with validation. So right at the wire level, right through down to the final result. So first up, we need to pass XML or JSON raw file serialization. If you can't get past that, no one can do anything. Then we go down to FHIR profiles or spec. Is this a questionnaire response? Was there a local profile involved? Then we're walking into the questionnaire response values. So did the data type that was entered, a value string in the questionnaire response, map to either a text or a string item type? Is this a coding? Did it map to a choice? So marry that content up from a terminology, make sure they're correct. Those required fields, make sure they're all there, except where enable when say that they don't need to be looked at. Answer options, check that those have been matched. Then there's a group of extensions we've got for minimum values for numerics and dates, maximum values, string lengths, regexes, and then the complex validation, which I'll jump to next. And then you can have straight custom validation, which is not shared. That information all comes through content messages, and compared to some of the other resources that get validation when they're saving, this is really targeted for users. So if you're going to put error messages in your expressions, make sure they're ones that a user is actually going to understand what to do. Cardinality 1 has been violated. That's a bad message. You need to enter in the date of birth. That's a much better. Or date of birth missing. And then the location of that. We do have an example, but I'll dive onto those. So complex validations are for doing cross-field validations. So if I've got 3 dates and I need to have them in a specific order, so I can't have an insurance claim before I've had an accident, in most cases. So I can put those sort of rules in. So if I've got one field that has to have a certain validation rule based on 2 others, I can put those in. Or I can do some really complex calculations that A times B divided by C means that my final value should be in this range. I can do that style of thing. And then custom error messages. Core resources do this type of thing with invariants. And so we defined an extension in the questionnaires to achieve exactly the same thing. And it can be either a warning, yes, we have the severity, so it can be either an error or a warning or an information message. So I do have an example of one of these. So here's an example where we've got a questionnaire constraint. It's got a key, so from a programmatic point of view, if I want to go and debug stuff later on, I know what that is. I know it's a severity error. Here's my nice big long Firepath error expression. And then I've got 2 locations. So there's 2 controls, so which is a prefix and a suffix. And then my human error is enter the claim number, prefix, and suffix. So that's the difference. And so I've got another one which says that the date of injury must be less than today. So I've got an evaluation on today against the actual question. And it says injuries must be on or before today's date. So there's some good examples. Yeah. So creating those questionnaires. So I won't go into a lot of these. I've just got a few screenshots to flick through them, and then I'll jump onto the prepopulate. So converting is from existing questionnaires is probably your best bet. you've got existing templates, go through, create conversions on them, and get through into that FHIR structure, do it iteratively, and then add extra stuff. And you'll probably find that by the time you get to the end of it, you've got all the capabilities of your internal questionnaire capabilities or forms capabilities, and you've got some more that are now available to you. The only times where I found that I wasn't able to replicate what was going on was where I had some custom JavaScript on a specific form for a specific thing. And that was very locked to that and wasn't even generic. So someone hand coded it and put it in. So US National Library of Medicine's got a good builder. Graham's Toolkit has one. Ours is broken at the moment because we're porting it up from 2 to 4. Beta software, which I believe Ilya will show later on. And at the last Connectathon, we had a new group turn up and say, hey, we've done this, which is really positive and good to see. So this is what the form builder from the National Library of Medicine looks like. This is the beta software version, which is still in progress. This is the Firepower tools, which is new. And if you're working with questionnaires, once you step past the basics and you start working with FHIRpath expressions, you need a good FhirePath tester. The FhirePath tester tool I wrote, it's in the Windows App Store, sorry for you Mac users, but that's what it is. And that can allow you to test, extract, it can test validation rules as well, so that's really useful for that. I won't go through these, but here's the source code and projects for a lot of the stuff that's out there. I do encourage you to go and look at it. And I'll jump straight into Prepopulation.
Brian, do you think we could have time for 1 or 2 questions, since we have a couple and just about a minute left?
So I'll show 1 second before I jump into that. Just the one thing with the Prepop questionnaire. So I've got this page. Go find that and actually try it out. So we can load in a definition, so which is a form with a Prepop definition. We can go and get the context, which actually retrieves the details out of your clinical system, and then we can extract, and then that goes and takes that content and fills it out into the form, and then away the user can go. So cool.
Thank you. Great presentation. There's one particular question, very interesting, from Jing Tang, with a couple of upvotes. The question is, despite the differences, can you translate structure definition from and to questionnaire one-to-one?
So so was that a structure map? Was that the question, or was it?
No, to a structure definition. From a structure definition to a questionnaire one-to-one.
So one of the things you'll find if you try to do structure definition to questionnaire direct, you'll find some oddities like identifier. So there's some data types where you've got some real knowledge in there, but you can go through. So I've done some profiling where I've taken a known profile, such as the one I did was an employee data entry form, and that mapped the worker record to a questionnaire. So I was able to capture the worker's details and some certifications, and then allowed a bi-directional conversion. So it is possible. And in the FHIR questionnaire item, there's a definition property, and that definition property points to the structured definitions element ID.
Thank you. One more question, then we'll have to wrap it up. Would you expect validation to be undertaken by the client, the server, or both?
I would expect it to be done by both. As an implementer of both, I have implemented both sides, and I have pretty close to complete validation on the server side, and almost complete on the client side. There are some stuff, so if you don't have access to the terminology, it's going to be hard to validate. So there are some limitations that you can experience.
Well, thanks a lot, Brian, for a great presentation. We'll have to wrap it up to give people time to move to other presentations. Very interesting for me too. I was happy to host this as a moderator. There are some other questions in the session Q&A. We can look at those and answer them offline. So thanks a lot again.
No worries. Thank you. And yeah, there's another session on forms Thursday by Ilya Beta, customizable universal forms, and that's sort of a follow on from this session as well. So I encourage you to have a look at that. Cool. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.